Well, good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome to another Webinar Wednesday hosted by Cal State Bakersfield Small Business Development Center. This is our Webinar Wednesday version number 344. Today is April 30th, 2025. Got a great webinar again. Telling you, running them back and forth, and this is going to be on ownership options for your small business. So, some employee based options, a lot of good questions that can come up today. So, we have back our business transition experts. And as you know, at the SBDC, we like to help those businesses that are starting and growing, expanding, and transitioning. So, we're on the transition mode today. A lot of things happening, if you look and talk to a lot of business experts, a lot of things going on in transition where people are either selling businesses, they're converting it to different forms of ownership, a lot of different options that are available. But there is kind of a grain and a selling for a lot of people that are moving on from their small business. And so we'll talk today about some of the ownership options for employee-owned firms, our capital quarter. I had so much fun with this last week. Our capital quarter, it's going to focus on funding bungles. So, funding bungles, is one thing. However, we'll look at some of the things from our recent survey that was conducted by the Federal Reserve Bank. Also, we're going to have some news and information and resources to help you thrive. Our economic corner is going to be on the first quarter growth numbers that came out today. Really, we're going to go really mild on actually the economic corner after having enough of that over the last several weeks. And I'm sure a lot of us are getting a lot of economic data right now. So we will take your questions live after the presentation today. So go into the Q&A box and actually leave a particular question if you have one. And we will get to that and have a nice discussion for any of your questions that you might have. Now's the time to get them answered. And also, our resources today are going to be in the chat box. And our Webinar Wednesday producer, Maureen Butcher-Dang, will be putting them in the chat box. So look at the resources and grab them out of the chat box at any time. And yes, a very brief, somewhat related poll today. So our one poll question we have today, kind of a simple poll question if you know the answer. But since you don't, we'll see. And that is going to be based on employee stock ownership programs. And so it's been around for quite a while, as you're going to learn a lot more about. So launching our particular, which is the largest company that is an ESOP operating in the US today. Is it General Motors? Is it General Motors? Is it FedEx? Or is it Public Supermarkets? So one of these is an ESOP, an employee stock owned business. And all three of these are obviously operating in the United States. Is it a large auto manufacturer, a delivery business, or a supermarket? So we have already 61% participating. I'm looking for one more vote so I can close this poll and share the results with you. And we will go ahead and do that under a nice, perfectly symmetrical bunch of numbers. Wow. Sharing the poll. We have 69% of you participating, and 33% say it's General Motors, 33% say it's FedEx, and 33% say Public Supermarkets. The correct answer is Public Supermarkets. Large East Coast supermarket in the South and the East and a lot of other places. Maybe find out a little bit more about their ESOP today too, as well as we go along with today's program. So thank you for participating in today's poll, and let's move along. So our capital quarter, which is a weekly feature here on Webinar Wednesday, talking about a lot of the things going on in trying to raise or access capital for your particular business. I was torn over a lot of different areas, and one was to potentially share one of the unique funding ways that individuals can purchase a small business. So when we get into the buying and selling of small businesses, I'm going to use that then. But there is kind of a unique way that you can do that with no money down. And the last time I checked from our viewing audience is they liked getting funding with no money down. So we'll save that for another day, or you can contact me and I'll tell you about it if you're already interested in it. But we have our 2024, Small Business Credit Survey, which we were a partner in 2024. And it is done by the Federal Reserve. And by being a partner, many of you on Webinar Wednesday reached out and completed the survey. We had over 100 respondents for that particular survey. And the Federal Reserve Bank was so kind to actually break out some of that information for us. So, one of the questions I think of about 50 or 60 questions in this survey was on reasons for seeking funding. And the dark bluish gray, the almost teal-like color, aqua, is for our SBDC, our CSUB SBDC, and the gray is for US firms. And so looking for some of the reasons why people are seeking funding and how they're different maybe than nationally. Well, there's meeting operating expenses, that is you know, pretty much standard between our center and the nation. Expanding businesses, not too big of a difference. Pay down refi debt. There's two areas, and one of them is make repairs or replace capital assets. So that was one area. And, we always like to suggest alternative ways of funding. And so when we see that 34% in our area compared to 28% nationally, replacing capital assets, and we always want to look at some of the unique ways of funding those particular assets. And one of those is through actually leasing. And leasing is kind of unique to where it is just basically a funding instrument in order to make it easier to actually purchase that particular item because that's all they do. They're in the business of selling equipment and leasing equipment. So the key thing about leasing, when you're leasing equipment, is if you have significant lease value, equipment value that you will be leasing, is that the unique thing is that you already have the collateral. So oftentimes in small business funding, collateral could be a particular issue. You already have the collateral. So there it is. And so maybe look at a leasing company. And the other one was, number two, which is to have available credit for future uses needed. And that is really kind of getting in front of it. The best tool out there for that would be a line of credit. And a line of credit is generally very beneficial if you have a seasonable business where you have revenues coming in during mostly part of the year at a very high level, and then don't. But also seasonal type businesses is, in addition to seasonal type businesses that are fluctuating based on types of seasons. So you have the Christmas season, for example, or the holiday season. So really, the line of credit is really a great tool for that, and it's really different from term funding, whereas you can actually borrow those particular funds and then pay them back at a later time. So really, a line of credit is really a great tool for looking at it. So those are some of the reasons for seeking funding and maybe a couple of solutions to help people out there. In looking at this, we really kind of wanted also to look at some of the challenges that our people are experiencing over that of, say, a national perspective. And, really jumping into a few of the things is that at least locally, we see that hiring and retaining quality staff in 2024 was a bigger issue when the survey was taken. And but it wasn't so much for our respondents. So it was much less the hiring and retaining quality staff. Some of the bigger issues was trying to utilize technology to whereas, and I'm thinking technology was so at the start of the AI era, so 37% locally compared to 26% nationally. And then also reaching customers and continuing to grow sales was a challenge. So those were some of the challenges that we saw. And the last slide I'll share on this particular capital quarter for this particular week is on the amount of debt outstanding at the time of the survey. And what you'll see is it just asks if you have no debt, if you had 100,000 less or more than 100,000. And no outstanding debt was pretty close. But when it came to the amount of outstanding debt, uh, local respondents had less than national, $100,000 or less, quite a substantial margin there. And the national audience had more than 100,000. And there could be a lot of reasons for that that we'll get into at another time. So we also have our community calendar function where we talk about some of the events coming up. And the U.S. Small Business Administration is kicking off National Small Business Week next week with a free manufacturing webinar. And SBA is putting in a big emphasis on helping smaller manufacturers and those interested in getting into the manufacturing segment. So here's a place where you can start on Monday, May 5th at 9 a.m. You can scan the code right there or pull the information out of the chat box that Maureen is probably inserting right now. And tomorrow, back in person, is the Kern County Economic Summit, and that'll be held at CSUB in the Student Recreation Center Gymnasium. So, all good things happening. And our economic corner kind of goes off of some news earlier today about the gross domestic product actually contracting 0.3% for the first quarter of 2025. And the biggest impact that surprised me that it went into this, I thought it worked the other way around, was the increased value of imports to beat the tariffs. So whereas consumer spending remained fairly strong, what we saw was that actually the actual tariffs and getting ahead of tariffs that were coming actually played a part in GDP going down for that particular area. So with consumer spending remaining strong, and consumers really drive the economy, it'll be interesting moving forward to keep that under mind. Our free human resource hotline for employers, you see a variety of different counties there. Call the county in your particular area to get free assistance from the California Employers Association to help with your employee needs and HR concerns that you have. Our SBDC tools to assist you, we have numerous. We're just going to update our CSUB YouTube channel. We are up to 453 subscribers. Boy, I'd sure like to get to 500 sometime this summer. So if you would like our webinar on a regular basis dropped into your email, subscribe to find out when it is actually uploaded to YouTube. So as you see, we have 298 videos on here. Watch Webinar Wednesday at your convenience. So that will always be there. So go to the CSUB SBDC YouTube channel and subscribe. You can contact us regarding confidential, no cost, no obligation expert consulting. Sign up on our website. We'll contact you for arrange an initial consultation. We'll get our experts in front of you and help whatever's wrong. Next week, we will be back for number 345. I'll be back with a better voice, I hope, on May 7th, 2025. Don Golick, the Fresno District Director for the U.S. Small Business Administration, will be here, and among other things, we're going to be celebrating U.S. Small Business Week next week. Which brings us to our special guest today. And that is Michael Balstad. And he's the founder of Bizleavable LLC, a firm specializing in exit strategies for small business owners wanting to sell or transition. A certified exit planner, I think that's important. Mike will discuss the options owners have for a smooth transition to retirement or the next phase of their life. He's worked with so many different business owners to help them accomplish this, and offer suggestions to sell businesses, to buy businesses. We have a working relationship with Michael. Talk to us. We can actually go beyond today's webinar with the services that Mike Balstad provides. So today's topic is going to be on transitioning potentially employee-based ownership. So Michael, come in and take it away, please.
Thank you so much, Kelly. It's great to see everybody again. What we're going to talk about today is an employee ownership. And I would love if, folks raise their hands if you've heard of employee ownership, but when you learned about it, it seemed like it was just for bigger companies. I would love to see if that's been anyone's experience. Because what ends up happening is, well, first of all, we'll go through our disclaimer. Information provided is supplementary materials. You'll be getting the slide deck as well. As the intent there for educational, informational purposes only. You can read this in depth if you are bored and having trouble falling asleep later on. But ultimately, the idea is that this is for informational purposes only. Everybody's situation is different. So please don't take any decisive business action without getting guidance on whether or how the things we'll be discussing today are relevant for your situation in your business. Fair enough? Excellent. Okay, so what we see over here is a cover. I've got a book that's coming out towards the end of June called Employee Ownership for the Rest of Us. And it's really around this concept of employee ownership as a means of transition. And a lot of people think, well, I know my employees, I know what I pay them, and there's no way they can afford to buy my business. I don't even know that they could run it on their own. And what I'm here to say is that by itself doesn't matter, because when an employee buys a business or through broad-based employee ownership, which is what we're discussing today, it's actually the financials of the business that pay for the financing to buy you out. So just because their earnings aren't there yet, that does not prohibit or really stand in the way of your employee or employees becoming a viable exit for you without ever even having to go to market. Imagine being able to sell your house, for instance, and you never had to list it. You never had to go find brokers. You never had to negotiate with anybody. You got to get fair, full market value. And that's an opportunity that can be had through employee ownership. So here's why it matters. So many of you may have heard of this idea of a silver tsunami. What we do know is that over half of owners right now are over the age of 50. 52% of them who were surveyed said they've done no planning whatsoever on how they're going to end up exiting their business. 2/3 of those expressed that it was because they didn't know where to begin, because the information, it hasn't been readily available to them. But in another survey, about 58% of all owners indicated that they want to be out in the next 5 years. That's 58% across all ages. So if we apply that to the small businesses in the US, which there's just about 34 million of them, you're talking about 17 million small businesses that could be facing a transition over the next 5 years. The challenge is going to be this. Only 1 in 5 businesses listed for sale ever do. The other 4 out of 5 go out of business in the process because the business typically is too dependent on the owner. And again, no planning or preparation, as was indicated on that previous survey I mentioned. So the businesses are very owner dependent. There's been no discussion on who would take it over. There's been no preparing of those folks. So regardless if it's a third-party buyer or whether it's employees, that preparation is going to be very important. And employee ownership is just a much shorter path to having a viable exit for you, a viable sale, if you will. And then next, the reason that it's important is that job losses and economic instability that result from failed transitions. So while a lot, if not the great majority of programming that you'll see with SBA and SBDC is really around that starting and growing businesses and managing businesses, expanding, international trade, there are only a few regions like Kelly's where they actually have a lot of discussions about the idea of transition. There's a lot of training on how to fly a plane, but there's not been a lot on how to land the plane. And so consequently, what you have are folks like yourselves who have established businesses and you have employees, right? A new business that starts usually has maybe no employees, maybe one or two. But the bottom line is for every mature business with, say, 10 employees that fails, usually due to a transition, it could take dozens of new business starts to replace those jobs in the marketplace because 9 and 10 new businesses fail within 15 years. So there's a lot of risk on both sides of the entrepreneurial equation. Doesn't it make a lot more sense to just keep the jobs that we already have by ensuring that there's continuity? Through employee ownership, what happens is the folks who helped you secure the future you're going to enjoy when you exit are going to have the ability to secure their own future as a result, and you still get paid. So overall, in the broad-based employee ownership landscape, there are 3 prevalent models. 2 of them account for 99% of those. There's employee stock ownership plans like Publix, who you heard mentioned, which is, the largest in the country, and they're one of the largest grocery chains as well. There are worker cooperatives, which would be like REI, where the employee stock ownership plan is a retirement plan like your 401k, except the only stock in that plan is the company stock itself. So where if you work for an employer, or even those of you who have a large enough business where you have a 401k for your employees, there's mutual funds in there and maybe a brokerage account. In an ESOP, it's just that company's stock. So for instance, I'm on the board of an ESOP in the Central Valley. We finished converting to 100% employee ownership. It'll be 2 years ago in June. So we're really excited about that. The company has about 70 employees, and that company has a 401k, right, that they had previously. But the ESOP itself is just a retirement plan that owns the stock of the company for the benefit of all the employees. That's how that's owned now. The former owner no longer owns it. It's now owned by the employees through a retirement plan, which means it will grow over time or shrink depending on the performance of the business. But here's the thing, for a company to become an ESOP, it has to be a pretty solid company to even jump the hurdles that it takes to be one. So that takes us to the worker cooperatives. While it doesn't have the legal and Department of Labor compliance requirements that a retirement plan has, and consequently the expense associated with it, the worker cooperative is a one worker, one vote. Employees have to buy in to that cooperative. It can be at a very low cost because they're going to look at what is the amount that can be afforded by the person with the smallest budget, right? So it doesn't have to be financially, extremely prohibitive to an employee, but they do have to make an investment. There's a lot of corporate governance, kind of a bureaucratic overhang to it, that can make, you have to have folks that are interested. It's an actual culture they have to take responsibility for. So those can be a challenge. And finally, one that you may not have heard of, it's called an employee ownership trust. There are only about 44 of them right now in the US, in the whole country. Where there are about 600 cooperatives and about 6,300 ESOPs in the whole country. So There aren't very many employee-owned businesses as it is, but only a handful of them are EOTs. And we'll get to talking to why in a moment. All right, so the limitations of ESOPs and cooperatives. Very high setup expenses. If you're setting up an ESOP, it's nothing to have about $100,000 upfront cost. I've seen it up to $250,000 to set those up. Most businesses, that's not going to be, something that works. For an ESOP, you've got to be $1 million or more, generally speaking, in profits and 20 or more employees. There's a difference between S Corps and C Corps. We're not going to get too in the weeds today, but just know that you've got to have a lot of profit. Most small businesses make less than $1 million in profits. So for most businesses, ESOPs are not a viable solution and never will be. Cooperatives can operate with fewer employees and lower profit, but you're still looking in the mid to high six figures of profit before it can even pencil out for you. And that's why you can look, and also it's ideal for larger or culturally specific businesses. And that's why one might ask, say, well, ESOPs have been around since 1974. There's all kinds of tax benefits to having them. I mean, someone who sells to an ESOP could effectively defer all of their capital gains taxes and not have to pay any capital gains taxes. Why aren't there more businesses like this? I mean, we're talking less than 0.02%. And the reason is exactly that. These two models just aren't relevant to the great majority of small businesses that don't have the size, culture, nor financial wherewithal for that to be a viable solution. So that brings us to employee ownership trusts. These are simpler, they're flexible, and they're affordable. There's no minimum size or complex regulatory requirements, and it's based on a trust, very similar to your revocable living trust. It's a trust document that manages it, but it's not a retirement plan. So consequently, it's accessible to most businesses, large and small. Now, there will become a question of whether it's practical. Like if you have no employees, it's probably not very practical, and there's some other solutions we can look at there. So when we talk about simpler, flexible, and more affordable, when you're setting up an EOT, it's just setting up another trust like the one that you have. It's niche. It's got some very specific things that it accomplishes. And what it accomplishes are the rules of the road for long-term ownership of the business. So it could be that you want it to operate for the benefit of all future employees, and it can never be sold. For somebody in a rural community, this could be very important, where you might think, you know what, if someone ever came and bought my business and decided to move it out of here, our small community would suffer because we would lose a number of jobs, and I want to protect those jobs, right? So that's a cultural and legacy concern, one that cannot be solved by any other means than trust or employee ownership. Because if you have a third-party sale, once they buy it, they can do whatever they want with it. With an ESOP, for most folks, this isn't going to be a way that it can happen. So with an EOT, you're setting up a trust that the terms of that trust dictate when, if, and how that business could ever be sold again. So you might say, I'm going to put all of my stock in this trust. I'm going to finance it. So basically the profits of the company will pay me until I'm paid off. Then from there forward, all of the profits will be distributed amongst current employees. They don't get direct ownership in the stock. They just get to benefit from the ownership while they're employees there. There's a trustee that makes the decisions in accordance with the trust on how profits are distributed. So it's no different than how you dictate with your family trust on how your assets are going to be distributed post, once you pass away. So because of that lack of complexity, it's much less of an investment to set them up. The cost where, a family trust, you might be, of a typical estate with, not a lot of complexity. you might be looking at $2,500 to $10,000, right, to do your estate planning. You're going to be looking at a bit more for that with an EOT because there is some complexity, but it's just to make sure on your part that you're getting everything that you want out of it, and uh, you're setting up boundaries on how people can operate that company, how and if they can sell it, etc. And because it's a trust and not a retirement plan, you've got ultimate flexibility. So while it is great for very small businesses because the investment to get into it is much smaller, it's great for any size of a company because if you have some legacy concerns and things that you want to accomplish that the requirements of an ESOP make that impossible because of government oversight and their restrictions, like how you're going to divide the profits and everything, you may want to favor some people where an ESOP isn't necessarily going to allow you to do that. Or the cooperative may not be a fit. You could have a multi-million dollar company, and I have a couple I'll share with you. There's one I saw today. It was a bakery in England that just it was a 400 employee bakery that just went fully employee owned after almost 100 years. And they did that through an EOT. So the benefits of EOTs, again, are that you get to preserve your legacy and community impact. You get to boost employee morale and productivity, and you get to retain local jobs and economic stability. This story's played out over and over again in communities all over the country, and really it's why I got into my business, this field roughly 27 years ago. My late father-in-law was one of the mustard seed kids in Bakersfield. Back in the day, he came over from Oklahoma. He grew up and went to war, and when he came back, he relocated to Northern California, and he started a cabinet shop. He started it from nothing in a small steel building, grew it into something that, he had 20 plus employees in his shop, and then he launched a cultured marble division. So not only did he support his family and have his definition of the American dream, but his employees had stable jobs. They're able to support their families, paying their taxes. They're able to support the programs in the local community. They're able to be a reliable source of goods and services to that community. So what happens when that business died, what should have been a preventable death? All of those jobs were lost. Those people now are on unemployment at the time, right? So not only have you lost the public benefit, but you've also now have people that are having to draw on public programs. So what if you were able to retain those local jobs once you leave, instead of being the 80% that go out of business and those folks lose their jobs, right? So there's huge value from an economic development standpoint of just keeping the jobs that already exist and making sure the resources are there for that. When we look at employee morale and productivity, the typical ESOP has a non-employee owned business has 300% or 3 times the turnover of an employee owned business. In other words, people quit or leave 3 times more often. And employee turnover is, I'm sure you all have experienced this, the cost of having to hire a new person after you've already trained and given experience to someone else. Now you're having to spread your time, either yours or a valuable employee, to train those folks. You're having to do that all over again. So you've greatly increased your payroll expense. You've reduced your productivity. Imagine if you could reduce your turnover significantly. And part of the reason is that they have that is they feel like instead of them just being an employee, they have a seat at the table. They've got an ownership mentality now. They're more productive. They're more engaged. It's proven. It's proven that employee-owned businesses are more profitable and enjoy, notwithstanding even on a few of these programs, there's tax benefits. Ignoring the tax benefits, these businesses are more profitable. And on top of that, employees of employee-owned businesses have a 92% higher net worth than those of non-employee owned businesses. So you can imagine when someone's looking at their future financial security and they're not just looking at 15, 20, $25 an hour and how they're going to parlay that not just into paying their expenses now, but also providing them a retirement that they didn't have to pay for. It's great for company morale. And then as far as your legacy, you're creating, if the important thing to you is that business remaining in the community. I have one of my clients that's looking at this as a solution, and they're also in the baked goods industry. They kind of see themselves as the town hall. They're in a rural area. And for them, this is a legacy for that business to be able to stay there. And they know they would be hard pressed, even though it's a great business that's been around for 40 years, because of where they're located, it's going to be very hard to find someone that would be willing to move up there to acquire that business. So instead, that's going to be a perpetually owned, employee-owned business from here on out. So it's really an elegant solution to a challenge that over the next 5 years is going to have a lot of fallout, because not only are most of these businesses not transferable and sellable, but in the third-party market, there aren't enough buyers for the number of sellers there are going to be. So I want to give you a couple of real-world examples. Both of these were done by a firm called Common Trust. One is called Clegg Automotive. They've got 55 employees. So not a tiny business by any means, but not a giant one. After becoming employee-owned, they enjoyed their greatest quarter in history and have since then doubled their profits. Another one called Optimax. These are both US companies. They have 400 employees. And the way they're doing it is the trust is buying out the owner with 25% of the profits. So those profits then go to pay off the seller note because he's carrying the financing. The remaining 75% is being shared amongst the employees. And then once the seller is paid off, that 25% will then go into reinvesting into growing the company. So again, at least one of those companies could have been an ESOP, but because of some of the flexibility that they sought, the employee ownership trust for them made a lot more sense. And at the moment, Kelly, before I get too far ahead, I want to make sure if there are any questions.
Michael, we do have a question. We do have one question so far, so feel free to jump into the Q&A. The question has to do with resident aliens. Can resident aliens, and I assume those are individuals that possess a green card, can you have somebody who's an employee who's a resident alien participate in the employee purchase, such as an EOT program?
So on an EOT, the trust is actually the buyer, not the employee. So if you have an employee that's legally an employee, they would continue being the employee. They simply would be getting a share of the profit. The same is true in an ESOP. If you're looking at an employee themselves buying the business, then for them, for an SBA loan, it's not required that one have citizenship. It is required that they have legal residence and they've got the legal right to work here and everything else. So as long as they fulfill those requirements that it takes them to be a legal employee and they're here, have a green card and such, if it's an EOT, they could still be your employee. If they were buying it, they could buy it so long as they're eligible for the SBA loan, unless you were financing. And I hope that answers your question.
Great. Hey, another one. How is the owner paid out of an EOT?
So we're going to get into some more detailed specifics in a few minutes, because there is some issue. Part of this book I have coming out is also aiming some guidance at policymakers, because there are some gaps and ambiguity in some of the law. You can see what they intended, but lenders generally aren't going to take chances on what they think it's going to be. Largely right now, there are a couple of ways that EOTs are handled. One is a seller note. The way the seller note works is you're simply financing it. And you're creating a trust. You're going to appoint a trustee to that trust. The trust is going to finance the acquisition of the shares from you, and it doesn't have to be 100%. In fact, I've got one interesting idea, a novel approach that I'm championing that's great for family businesses. But effectively what you would have is you would finance the note. The company would pay you over time. You could set the note up any way that you want, and you could remain CEO of the company until you're paid off, right? So as long as the company owes you money, you could set up to say, I want this as part of my retirement. I just want to take some of my risk off the table right now. So I'm going to sell part of the company to the trust. I'm going to get cash for that. The company is going to distribute, to me, payments on a loan for that. And, effectively you would be getting earned out while you're still there. And then eventually you could either A, sell the rest of it to the trust and carry the note, or B, when legislation changes, you might be able to just get an SBA, the trust could get an SBA loan to buy you out. The second way things are being carried out right now there are a couple of funds, one with project equity and one with common trust, I believe, and then there are a few others where they will put up the capital. So because largely you're not, it's difficult to get some of the bank, certainly the government backed loans right now. There's private capital that's become available, and we can, individually, for those of you who are interested, we can kind of take a look at your situation and see what makes the most sense. But, by and large, it's you personally funding it, carrying a note, or looking into some outside private capital that is available for that purpose. Okay, so how EOTs work in practice. First, you're going to work with an attorney. It could even be your estate planning attorney that's going to guide you through setting up a trust structure for ownership. Right now, there are very few attorneys in the country that have specialized experience in this space. So it could be that you work with one of the limited attorneys, and I've got referrals for folks. One of the limited attorneys that do have experience in drafting these trusts for the US. These have been widespread in UK for a long time, since the early in the last century. But in the US, they're just starting to catch on here. Next, you're determining the beneficiaries. The beneficiaries are, how are the profits being distributed? Is everybody getting it equal? Are there different, classes of folks that are getting these distributions? Because again, it's not a retirement plan, so it's not subject to ERISA. And then finally, establishing governance and profit sharing models. What do those models look like? What do the resale of the shares look like? Because it could be that you say, you know what, I don't need the money out of this. I just want to benefit my employees. I'm just gifting all of my stock to this trust. I've got plenty of other assets. I'm just going to benefit my employees because their hard work got me a great retirement. Not everybody can afford to do that. Not even most people can. But for some people, it's genuinely something they want to and can do. So in that case, if you're giving it away, you may not like the idea of someone being able to take your valuable gift later and sell it and make a mint. So those are set up as a perpetual trust that can't be resold. And again, going back to my original disclaimer, all of this is educational, and for each individual circumstance, you do have to get specific legal advice. That's the only legal advice I give, is that you absolutely need legal advice when you're in business. Okay. And through all of this, you get step-by-step practical guidance because there's a number of steps to go through. Can the business afford to finance that note? If it can I keep the same salary I have while it's doing it, right? There's a whole chain of things that we're going to calculate to determine whether that trust is feasible. It's different than the feasibility study for an ESOP or a cooperative. This is largely around can the company afford to cover the note? And B, do you have adequate leadership there to run the business in your absence? And here's the thing about that. Regardless of whether you're selling the business or giving it to an employee ownership trust or not, that should be a focus of every business owner, is ensuring that the business is not dependent on you. So it's not unique to an EOT or any other employee ownership that you ensure that you have solid leadership in place, because any buyer is going to want that, because they want to know that when you step away, it's not just going to fall apart. Okay. So funding an EOT. You've got seller financing where you're carrying a note, retained earnings. That's another piece. If you've got cash in the company, you could draw that cash as part of your buyout. If you have permanent life insurance in the company with cash value, that could be part of your buyout. I've seen that done. Bank financing, again, that's going to be few and far between, but we'll be looking at that. And then gifted shares. So those are the 4 ways, broadly speaking, to fund an EOT right now. So the pros of the seller financing are that if you're selling it to the trust for fair market value, generally speaking, if you're carrying a note, you're not going to be taking all of your capital gains at one time. You'll be spreading it over time. So you'll be able to spread out those liabilities. That's one pro. Secondly, because you're carrying the note, you have the flexibility that if the company is going through a challenging time, you have the ability to be flexible on repayment in a way that a bank is not going to. So you can, through the interim, while it's transitioning to new leadership, or if you're making that change in the middle of a difficult economy, or if you're making, like now we're having uncertain times. We don't know what the next 6 months to 2 years is going to look like. So right now there's some uncertainty, yet I know just by the statistics, half of you in the room right now have been thinking about selling or getting out of your business, because that's roughly what the surveys say. So if you're thinking about getting out now, there's some concerns about how you would do it. Could it get financed? Am I going to get highest and best value for the business? If you're carrying the financing, you get to decide how much you're selling, whereas with an SBA loan, there could be some restrictions if they were doing that. If it were another bank, your interest rates would be high. Well, in SBA too, those interest rates are going to be higher. Right now, they're very high if you're looking at a 7A loan, because it's based on Prime Plus. You could actually finance it and determine your own interest rate that's lower, which makes it more affordable to the business, so that you're giving yourself a good chance that the company would survive and weather that. So you've got a lot of control on how to take the payments, how to give breaks on the payments, forgiving payments if you want. You've got ultimate flexibility, and where other folks wouldn't be in their best interest to do that, but for you, it may be. The cons are that if you're financing that note, and let's say it's 100%, and let's say you didn't take any money down, you didn't take it, and this would be the same if you were financing a loan for anybody. If the business fails, effectively you don't get your money, right? So you've put all your risk on the table. So one of the ways to mitigate that risk when I'm talking with folks, regardless of what their exit strategy is, if we're looking at a transaction, what I always recommend is taking a look at what your capital needs are going to be when you leave the business. Are you going to have an upfront expense for moving, acquiring another property, paying off personal debt? If you've got some known amount of capital that it's going to take to do that, I would make sure that your down payment is no less than that. Therefore, if it gets defaulted on, at least that piece was taken care of, if that makes sense. So just insulate yourself against those business risks by designing a transaction, appropriately. Kelly, any more questions at this time?
Absolutely. Are most EOTs set up as a seniority based, as in longevity? And how long do employees typically work out before retiring?
So EOTs in the US have such a short track record, I could not give you a meaningful statistic. I mean, just last year it was 40, and now there's 44. So there's not a lot of anecdotal information yet to really talk about that. Generally, on employee ownership, you've got tenure is double on ESOPs. So we can look at ESOPs and see that employee ownership generally leads to longer tenure because people know that on an EOT, they don't get to take anything with them. So if they leave, they give up all the profits. That's what they give up. So if they leave a job working for you, for instance, making $25 an hour because someone else offered them $30 an hour, they likely wouldn't do it because if the company's profitable, the profits they're getting could very well be way more than the other company would be able to offer them. So that's the best I can tell you, is that from the other ownership models, I can tell you that it's significantly longer. And I can also forward to Kelly some statistics for that as well.
Hey, Michael, can the EOT be used for a non-employee purchase? Say I want to sell it to my 3 nephews.
Absolutely. And in fact, one of the uses that I think, and why I think that the EOT is actually going to be the biggest form of employee ownership. First of all, it's most relevant, right? It's the only one that's a fit for most small businesses. But the other piece is, if you look at a family business, 9 in 10 US small businesses identify as a family business. When I look at my late father-in-law's business, he had a son that worked in the business, right? And he was much younger than than his dad, obviously, 30 years younger. So at a time that he would have wanted to retire, his son would have not been ready to take over the reins of that business. So ultimately, what family businesses generally rely on is the key employees to be around to keep that business stable until that child or younger family member is ready to take over. The challenge is, the dynamic that typically happens is those key employees that have been there for 30 years that help create all that value for the owner, they take it personally when the kids take over. I mean, obviously it's a family business, they shouldn't, but still in the back of their mind, they're like, I've worked here 30 years, and Junior or Susie get to walk in here with a silver spoon. And what do I get for it? So it's not in their best interest, and they can just go somewhere else or become a competitor. Well, if you set up an EOT and you contributed, say, 30% of the shares to that EOT, and let's say that the idea that your nephews were to take it over one day, you contribute that to the EOT. Part of the culture is also talking about how the nephews are going to take over running the family business one day. It is now in those key employees' best interests to support those employees. Why? Because they've got 30% of the company. What also could be drafted into that, and this is the piece that I've kind of come up with, is that it can be written into the trust that those family member employees, it could be written in that they have the right to buy those shares back at a future date and you could prescribe how the value would be calculated. Well, if they were to do that, that would be a windfall to the employees. They didn't have to pay anything for the shares, but for everybody who's an employee at that time, it could be written that they get the proceeds of that share sale. So those employees would have a choice. Do we allow it to continue to be 30% employee owned, or do we want to own 100% of it and they get the winnings? They'd have that flexibility. So I know it's a really long answer, but yes, you could have non-employees. You can set it up any way that you want.
Great.
Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is policy environment and support systems. This is where things have to catch up. So obviously, when we look at the Main Street Employee Ownership Act of 2018, the California Employee Ownership Act of, I think it was in 2021, both well-intentioned. They both meant to Main Street, increase Main Street employee ownership, because it does two things. It gives the owners that built these businesses an actual way out that gives them a secure retirement while preserving those jobs. The problem is, again, the two models that are prevalently used are mostly suited towards lower middle market businesses. Maybe a little below that, right? Where you look at only about 19% of businesses are over $1 million, right? So the majority of businesses are not a fit. So it just is a blind spot. So there is some catch-up that has to be done from a policy standpoint. One of the things, when we look at ERISA, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974 is where they codified ESOPs. And part of ESOPs was that if you have a C corporation, you get to, when you sell to an ESOP, more than 40%, you get to defer capital gains by buying a replacement property. No different than if you've got a rental and you sell the rental and you do a 1031 exchange. 1042 is the same thing in selling your business to an ESOP. Works the same way. That works for ESOPs, and you do get similar tax treatment for cooperatives. Main Street Employee Ownership Act similarly made it so that SBA could actually now lend on these transactions where before they couldn't. The challenge is there's some ambiguity in the SBA SOP as it relates to trusts that I found on one of the pages, and there may be some others too, that would need to be straightened out, where banks, no one wants to be the guinea pig. So no one wants to test that. So there's some ambiguity that is going to have to be addressed so that the bank loans can be there, and that so the tax benefits are there. I'll get back to the taxes in a minute. Some of you might say, well, if I don't get a tax benefit, I don't want to talk about it. Trust me, there's still a reason to talk about it. It's best not to let the tax tail wag the dog 100%. All right. So the importance of clear policies and adequate funding, and then the role of technical assistance and expert advisors like SBDCs, chambers of commerce, SBA, that typically have not been involved in the employee ownership process, now getting more involved with folks like myself that are bringing education to the forefront on this and resources. So lessons to be learned from the UK. EOTs have been around their country for a long time. The John Lewis Trust is their largest EOT, has 85,000 employees. It's been around since the late 1920s. And so it's very successful, owns grocery stores, much like Publix does. But they really didn't take off in earnest until they started getting the tax breaks. That's what really started driving things for EOTs in the UK. Likewise, when you look at ESOPs in the US, there were ESOPs prior to 1974, but once you had the tax breaks and everything codified into law, you saw a big expansion. So right now you see an average of 248 new ESOPs a year. So here's the troubling math. In 2000, we had 6,000 ESOPs in the US. That's after, so in 2000, after 36 years, we only had 6,000. So fast forward to 2024, end of 2024, there were only just over 6,300. So in what does that wind up being? 24 years, we went up a net 300 and change ESOPs. Why is that? ESOPs are run so well and have such low turnover and have great cultures that, sure, there are some that quit, but lots of them are acquired. They are big acquisition targets by big companies. So you see some attrition through acquisition with ESOPs. And so you've got, and still we've got less than 0.02% of employee ownership. When you started seeing when you started seeing SBA loans being allowed to be used for ESOPs, then you start seeing, and when the Employee Ownership Act came out in 2018, I started getting a lot of push from the SBDCs in California to talk more about ESOPs. I had to take them to a conference showing them by one of the big ESOP providers of how difficult it is to become an ESOP and why most businesses can't. So there's been a big push for it. There just hasn't been the viability. So once they expand the rules to push education at the level of the EOTs, you'll see much expansion in the area of financing, education, service providers. A lot of that, I think, is going to be in the technical assistance area, like with the SBDCs. And here's why. You can imagine if it costs $100,000 to $250,000 to set up an ESOP, the folks who do that aren't going to have much of an appetite of working with someone who it costs less than $50,000 to set one up and doesn't have a lot of ongoing maintenance, doesn't have annual appraisals that have to be done, right? So the folks that are in that market aren't going to work down market into this space. So it's really going to be mission led. That's why I do it. I have private clients that I work with. My work with SBDC has been very mission driven. So we develop resources so that they can be accessed affordably by small business. I think the other thing that will happen is that when the California Employee Ownership Act finally gets funded, it's been in law now for 4 years, I think, or coming up 4 years, but they never appropriated funds. Once they do, part of the mandate of that law is to help offset half of feasibility and implementation costs. So it'll become less costly and prohibitive for small business owners to look at this. And again, that goes to the barriers. I spoke ahead of myself, my apologies. So when we talk about the improving access to capital and resources, you've got, first of all, the California Employee Ownership Act. Other things that I'm pushing toward are any of the groups that get state small business credit initiative, the SSBCI federal funds. Those are also allowed to be used for employee ownership. So that's something else I'm championing to help bring more resources available to small owners like you who want to consider it. Because one of the biggest obstacles, honestly, that stands in the way is that, particularly for the co-ops and the ESOPs, before you can even do it, you've got to get a feasibility study done. And that can cost, I've got a client that they got charged to do a feasibility study for an EOT, and they got charged over, I want to say it was $10,000. It was something that really didn't need to have that price tag associated with it. It really just needed to have a debt service. Cooperatives, yes. ESOPs, yes. The EOTs doesn't have to be as costly, but even if they are, for most small business owners to say, I've got to invest $10,000 to find out if this is even an option, and I may find out that it's not, most business owners aren't even going to take the chance. They can't afford to, potentially waste $10,000. So that's another obstacle that stands in the way of people even finding out if it's feasible. So, back a napkin, I help people figure out if they're even close before you ever go through anything like that. You don't have to spend a fortune on that already. Once these laws get funded, you'll even have, more access than just me. So here's a call to action for business owners who are either haven't considered any strategy for exit yet, or specifically have been thinking about employee ownership. First, start planning early. The best time to start planning is the day you open your business. The next best time is today. Start with the end in mind, thinking about what an exit would look like for you, so that we could then work backwards and figure out what the steps are that need to happen to make that feasible, to figure out what value has to be created for you to be able to afford to live on your proceeds, right? Next, engage employees and advisors, not necessarily in that order. For some of you, you talked about your nephews. I wouldn't have it formal, but I certainly would be having a conversation with them about, first of all, for yourself, why are you considering them? Some people will consider an extended family member because they planned for it to be their kids, and then they found out the kids didn't want it. That happens all the time. So you may be thinking, well, it's just that. So we can go through your whys that you're choosing a nephew. If you're sure that you wanted to go to them, then it would be having a discussion with them, if you haven't already, that you're thinking about this. But I'd be talking with them about, hey, one day I'm going to retire. Would you guys be interested in being involved in the business? I would say this. If they say yes, but they don't want to work there, they just want to get a passive performing asset, I think there have to be some further discussions, because they at least need to have some kind of working understanding of the business to know if it's being run well, right? So to make sure that, they're getting what they should out of the business and that they're not being taken advantage of. Otherwise, you're losing one of the main benefits of having that EOT. They need to be able to be a check and balance on any part of it that they're supposed to benefit from. For employees, once you're sure about this idea of EOT, at least that it's a strategy you want to consider, then it's about start having conversations about your eventual retirement and wanting an opportunity for your employees and having an educational session. And it can be very informal. And I'm glad to help you with that. Because for you, it may be you never even thought there was a chance for there to be employee ownership. Well, trust me, your employees don't either. Most of them would have no idea that they could get your business without having to come up with millions of dollars, right? Most of them wouldn't even have an idea of what a business is worth. So showing that there's a means for them to become employee owners without having to come up with a bunch of money, you're going to find some serious advocates. And what they're actually doing for you is they're paving a way for you to have an exit that finds you financially secure, right? They become part of that plan, and you guys are literally a team at that point because they're on the same side of the table as you. And once you know that there's at least an interest and you've got a path, whether it's through having a few family members involved, whether it's going to be employees, whether there's another model you want to discuss, there's some community options out there. Then we start looking at feasibility. And like I said, I'm not talking about where you've had tons of discussions and you're way down the road. If you know that your nephews are roughly interested, you know that your employees would have some involvement, and that there's folks that would stick around. If you've got two nephews that are younger and the rest of your employees are retirement age, that's not necessarily going to work, right? You're going to need to start recruiting some younger folks, so that your nephews aren't just losing everybody right when you retire. But presuming that you've got that kind of figured out, you know who your serious employees are that will stick around and that will, they'll be team players and they're really going to work at this, and you know that your nephews, this is a real serious option. We can sit down and take a look at what it's going to be. Mostly, you have to have people that are coachable. That's the first piece. The second piece is that we need to figure out that there's debt service on the revenue. We need to see that the business can afford to pay you whatever salary it is that you want to continue receiving, plus your payments on the loan. We can model that. That's not a big deal. That's something, if it's something I'm working with on SBDC, like if I end up with a contract with Bakersfield on this, it's something we can just do on an advisor appointment. It's not a big deal. It can at least give you kind of a back of napkin understanding of what the financing would look like if you were to carry it. If we're looking at bank financing, like I said, that's going to be a little higher. Their restrictions are higher, and right now the interest rates, unfortunately, are significantly higher. So for policymakers, they need to prioritize economic or employee ownership and economic development, because again, keeping the jobs you have is a much better investment than trying to create new jobs because people lost their jobs. So at least part of their policy making and economic development should be supporting employee ownership, having programs specifically for that, create clear policies and dedicated funding, and foster public-private partnerships and community initiatives. So to wind it up here, the pros: you have more design flexibility. They're potentially more cost-effective. In most cases, they're going to be. There's the least bureaucratic burden of any of the models, and you get great employee retention. The cons are that they currently lack federal tax benefits that are afforded to ESOPs and co-ops. A few states are offering state-level benefits already. California is not one of them yet. Because of relatively recent active promotion in the US, lower ownership, lower awareness, proficiency, and fewer knowledgeable service providers. So it's just because it's kind of early in the game, any of you considering it are early adopters. It's not a gray area of the law or anything like that. It's just not been widely adopted yet, but it's certainly something that can be done. The resources are there. You might say, well, the tax thing's big for me. For smaller businesses, the tax liabilities may or may not be as great as you think. Secondly, if you're a C corporation and if you've had your stock since 1995, there's another opportunity to deal with your capital gains. So there are a number of, first of all, identifying whether a means to mitigate tax liability sounds great, but I think the first thing to figure out is, would it even be that significant of an issue compared to the cost of going with one of the other routes? The second piece would be that you could say, well, maybe what I do is I do want to start this process. I'll sell part of it now, and then I'll wait to sell the rest, and hopefully we'll gain that tax benefit later. If not, hopefully you've grown the business, you'll be able to sell the rest of it at a higher value later, right? So you're not, you're selling part of it now, getting some risk off the table, letting the business continue to grow, and probably will grow even more because you'll have more engaged employees, you'll have more profitability as a result, less turnover, all of those things. You may be, your second bite of the apple may be at a much higher value later. And with that, I'd love to open it up for any questions that people may have.
Wow, great information. Let's see if there are any questions. Okay, here's one. What might an employee potentially see as a risk or disadvantage to entering an EOT?
Well, again, an EOT, think of an EOT as no different than a business entity. The employee has no cost. They don't have to pay anything, right? So it would be similar to if you were saying, well, I'm just changing from an S Corp to a C Corp, or I'm changing from an LLC to an S Corp. Or it could be the risk, more likely risk would be you're selling your business to somebody else, right? Because that's all it is. It's a transaction. It's a transaction that sells the business. All of the employees are still employees of that business. Nothing has changed in that respect. In fact, if you're still remaining as CEO while you haven't sold all of it, nothing changes for them. It's completely transparent for them, except they're going to start getting some profits. So for them, it's going to be a net benefit. Other than that, they shouldn't see any difference.
Great. And final question is, what is the typical timeline for establishing an EOT?
Well, that's going to kind of be all over the board. It's going to depend on financing. It's going to depend on uh, how quickly you're able to get all of the required documentation in order and how quickly your providers, attorneys, et cetera, participate in that and follow up and get their work done. But you should be able to get that done inside of a calendar year. And that may sound like a long time, but you're starting from the beginning with not even having an idea that such a thing even existed. So then you got to figure out, what would I want it to look like? What do I want my timeline to look like? What do I need to do to clean up the company financials so that if I need to get outside financing, that a bank's going to be willing to look at it. So a lot of it too is going to be determined by how well the business is currently situated to obtain financing.
Okay. Fantastic stuff. Thank you so much, Michael.
Of course. Oh, I want one more caveat to that. If you were to tell me, well, I need to be able to net we'll just use a number. I need to net $500,000 after all is said and done. And if we found that right now you would only net 250, well, then it's going to be a matter of how long will it take to grow the business for you to be able to get to that 500. So you might say, okay, well, if you grew the business at 24% a year, we could do that in 3 years. If you grew it at 15% a year, it would be 5 years. So a lot of it too depends on if the business is sized to where you need it to be to get your proceeds.
Excellent. Okay. Well, that's going to wrap us up for number 344. Michael, any last comments?
Not at all. Just thanks everybody for attending. And I look forward to assisting any of you who would like to help.
Yeah, and we'd like to help you assist them, assist whatever. So,
Looking forward to it.
so we're all involved in this. So a great way we can move forward, and look forward to continuing to work with Michael on a number of things. Got that new book coming out. I know the SBDC library will be purchasing one. I hope it's signed, of course.
Of course.
And so we want to get on that particular list. I'll talk to you offline about how to do that, and we will actually promote it once you have more information when it's getting closer to the release date. So,
Excellent. Thank you.
and so that wraps us. So for our producer, Maureen Busherdang, Michael Balstad, I'm Kelly Bearden. We'll be back next week for number 345. Everybody have a great week. Take care.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.